Tom Homan, who's providing new details on the administration's immigration policies. In an interview he gave to NBC News, Homan says it will be up to the undocumented parents of U.S.-born children on whether or not to break up their families.
We have no plan to separate children from parents. The parents will have to make a decision. That's parenting 101. But if you chose, I'm going to say it again, if you choose to have a child here in the United States while you know you're here illegally and you know you're on a court order to deport, that's on you. So I think most parents will keep their families together. We say detention, but it's not in a jail setting. This is actually an open air campus family type facility that is open air, right? So we're not talking about razor wire and a penal institution, things like that, to have child care, to have education.
Meanwhile, in a separate interview with the Washington Post, Homan says that only trained law enforcement officers will be able to make immigration arrests, but that National Guard troops could provide other support functions. Homan says the administration will conduct targeted campaigns for people with criminal records rather than sweeps through neighborhoods. The incoming border czar says he will not put a hard number on target deportations, saying the amount would depend on immigration and custom enforcement resources. He says he would, quote, be setting myself up for disappointment by providing a hard number. During the conversation, we have former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro. He is an MSNBC political analyst, and the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. Mr. Secretary, let's start with you. Just your reaction here to what Tom Homan, the incoming border czar, has to say on two things. First, how he described these sort of open-air detention centers. And then secondly, this idea of putting the onus on parents, saying it's up to them how many members of their families get deported.
Yeah, and I'll start there. I didn't agree much with him, but George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, used to say that family values don't end or don't stop at the Rio Grande, meaning that these were families that were coming to the United States trying to leave desperate conditions, lack of safety, trying to flee from violence, sometimes hunger. So these are parents that are trying to do the right thing for their children and for their family. They're doing it out of love. They're not picking up and leaving and moving somewhere thousands of miles away just on a whim. So for Tom Homan to say that, I think it just shows you again the heart of cruelty, the dark heart that he and Trump administration folks have for these migrants. They like to dehumanize them. And the way that he speaks there is also very clinical and bureaucratic, disconnected from the real life of these people, of these human beings. And so I think that what we're in for cruelty part 2 in this administration.
Lauren, talk about the numbers. It's interesting to hear Tom Homan really resisting the idea of putting any numbers on this, but to some extent, numbers do matter. Every president has deported some people during the course of their administration. Barack Obama famously deported actually more people than Donald Trump has done. There have been numbers floated of up to 1 million per year for the next 4 years of the Trump administration, which would far outstrip previous presidents and would get us beyond the idea of just deporting people who have committed crimes outside of being here illegally. So where do you, have you heard anything more on actual numbers, and how important are the numbers, do you think?
Well, they are important, but I don't think they know, and I think he's equivocating for a reason, and that is that there are just a vast amounts of sort of unknowables. First of all, we don't know the extent to which governors and state law enforcement will or will not participate. I think that's going to depend a lot on what they're being asked to do. I think Democratic governors are in a really complicated position because on the one hand, they certainly don't, most of them certainly would not agree with family separations. On the other hand, they're also under pressure from their own constituents around safety and crime. So I think where there are, truly targeted deportations on folks who are in fact criminals, but that's not what Tom Homan is saying. And I think that's what makes it so disturbing, is that they see anyone who's entered the country as having committed a crime. And I think most Americans don't see it that way. We've got families who've been here for decades who are law-abiding, tax-paying citizens or non-citizens who have citizen children. And I think the reality of this, and also, frankly, what it could do to the American economy, if you consider what this would do to the labor force. We already saw huge disruptions in Florida and in other states where they've done, intensive raids on undocumented communities who largely fill jobs that Americans don't fill. So the numbers matter. They have no idea. I think that's why he's equivocating. And this is going to be a lot of chaos for the next few months if they're serious about this.
Secretary Castro, one of the things that we're beginning to also hear is some people that voted for Trump are now concerned about those that have farms that, well, a lot of the undocumented immigrants have worked on their farms, have done other types of things that are needed from a agricultural business point of view or other points of view. And they're starting to say, wait a minute, if this mass deportation happens, who's going to do this work? How do we do that? Secondly, the concern is that in order to finance a lot of this, they're going to have to find the money somewhere, which could also impact entitlement programs. And a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to see a huge budget here that would impact Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, whatever comes about. You ran HUD, you have been a member of the cabinet. How do we govern this and how do we finance this without some people in America being hurt by it?
Yeah, Reverend. I mean, this is a real source of concern. It's a problem for the United States, whether you're talking about the ag industry or we're talking about the construction industry, the hospitality industry, the American economy, and people can like it or not, but those are the facts. The American economy is dependent in part on the labor of undocumented immigrants. And in certain industries like agriculture, that's true in a very big way. And so when we talk about mass deportation, when Trump talks about that, to actually do it would decimate the American economy. And on top of that, it's estimated, and I think y'all just showed the figure there by some, that it could cost up to $1 trillion to do. That means that you would lose the revenue that these folks produce and the positive effect on the economy, and you would also have Americans paying for it by the high cost of mass deportation. On top of that, in the long term, you have a United States where the birth rate is declining and the number of baby boomers as a big generation, right, are turning 65 and taking out their well-earned Social Security and Medicare. And so you have the need for a greater labor force that these folks in part can help supply. So we're going in the wrong direction. We need to find a sensible way to have immigration reform, but mass deportation is not the answer. And we're going to find out the hard way as a country if Trump actually goes forward with it.
So, Lauren, President Biden has deliberately sort of been off stage since the election. He's delivered a few speeches meant to burnish his legacy, certainly still conducting foreign policy. But aides have made a deliberate choice. He's an institutionalist. He doesn't want to be seen as getting in the way. But aides say that he will be more present in his last few weeks of his term. What would you like to see him do here, particularly as we just talked about, the fact that so much potentially is going to change for this nation come noon on January 20th? What can President Biden do between now and then, those 3.5 weeks, to ready the nation, prepare us for what's coming?
That is such a hard question, Jonathan, because I'm not sure there's a good answer. I mean, the fact is that many of the actions that President Biden has tried to take have been overturned by the courts. I mean, certainly, like any action that can be taken to try to protect dreamers in a more significant way, I think is going to be important. I'm not sure what other choices he has. The courts have limited his power on that front. It'll be really interesting to see if there are additional kinds of clemency and other pardons that he does in the last few days. But yes, he's been exceptionally quiet. I also wonder, since you mentioned foreign policy, the extent to which he may try to secure some additional arms and aid or accelerate at least the delivery of those things to the Ukraine, knowing that the Trump administration seems unsupportive of Ukrainian sovereignty and the Ukrainian prosecution of the war against Russia. So, look, I mean, I think the biggest issue is whether or not Biden is going to make any progress on getting the Israeli hostages out before he leaves office, which I'm sure is weighing heavily on him. I know that Blinken is working overtime to try to, make some progress there. That would be the most significant progress that he could make, is to secure at least some hostage releases before he leaves office. There's a few weeks to go, one hopes.
And Lauren, back to you also for the idea of Vice President Harris. We talked about her earlier in the show. There's a new photo book out here. Talk to us about how you see her legacy, the history that she made over the past 4 years, even if she didn't quite win the Oval Office.
I've really been thinking about this because I think in a lot of ways, the fact that she did lose the election has overshadowed what was so extraordinary and important about her accomplishments as the first female vice president. And I think history is going to look kindly on her term. She was an extraordinary advocate on issues that matter to women in ways that we have never seen before. And I think like many women, and really anyone who is the first, who is a trailblazer, they carry an extra heavy load and the burden is, really upon them. It is an incredibly difficult road to, path to walk, but she has done it with grace. I think she's made some really important strides on behalf of women in the country. I think the ways in which especially she's defined the abortion rights issue as a freedom issue in this time will be looked back on as defining. And I hope we, take a moment to acknowledge her extraordinary history-making contributions and not just, leave her sole legacy as having lost the presidency, because there's so much more that she's accomplished in her time.
So, Secretary Castro, let me take the last question to you here. Let's just get your overall thoughts on the combined Biden-Harris legacy. They're 4 years in office, during obviously a very monumental time for this nation. How do you think this team will be remembered?
They came to power, they came into leadership at a time when America desperately needed moral leadership and competence in the White House. And they provided that. That when you compare where our economy was in the United States in January of 2021 to where we are now, compared to the rest of the world, especially America, has done very well. They moved away from things like family separation and the cruelty of the Trump administration. There was an adult back in the Oval Office, which is what people had voted for in 2020. I think that's one of the main reasons that Biden won. People wanted an end to the chaos back then of Trump that we're about to see again. And so this is a team that I think will be remembered for righting the ship in a lot of ways. Obviously, there were disappointments, failures even, like there is for any administration. Part of Biden's legacy also will be that he did not step aside sooner and perhaps give the vice president, I think, an even better shot at winning and continuing on his legacy. But the historians will, take all of that and we'll get a better view as the years go by. But they came at a time when America desperately needed real leadership and in so many ways provided that.
Former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro, and co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.